What's up, everyone? Liam here from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thanks for tuning into this production walkthrough of my tune Pipe Dream. It's out now on Calibrate Records. You can stream it, buy it at all the usual places. And yeah, super stoked about the release. And let's jump right into it. So I thought it would be a good idea to start from the beginning with a few of the elements, the drums and the bass. So I usually start all my projects in Machine. The software itself isn't too friendly. I definitely rate FL Studio or Ableton, but it does work very seamlessly with Native Instruments hardware. So yeah, it's nice to get my hands off the mouse and the keyboard during the creative process. Starting with the drums, Native Instruments Machine setup is not too complicated. We've got the tracks on the left-hand side here, and then kind of MIDI roll of the notes on the right-hand side, and plugins are up here on the left. So yeah, the snare in this tune is made out of 4 layers. I like to make my drums using samples, layering samples to get different sounds, as opposed to actually making them in a synth like Serum or FM8. Sometimes I'd use Addictive Drummer or DrumLab, but for this tune we have 4 samples. Altogether they sound like this. Each layer is kind of doing its own thing, and I like to have a spectrum analyzer open, Vox and Go Span, when doing this sort of thing, so I know which frequencies are kind of lacking and which frequencies need some love. But yeah, all 4 layers individually sound like this. Not really too much processing going on here. Mainly just some inbuilt saturation or drive, and then yeah, some transient shaping using Machine's inbuilt transient shaper. Yeah, nothing too fancy there. Same thing is going on with the kick. This kick is kind of, I divided it up into 3 separate layers: the kind of low end sub of the kick, the mid-range, and then a little bit of noise on the top to add some width to the sound. So yeah. Not too much processing on these layers either. A little bit of drive on the mid layer, and some compression and drive on the white noise layer. Next up are some of the breaks, which is a really nice feature of Machine. The sampler has a slicing section, and here there's different modes to slice up samples. The one I use most often for breaks is the detect mode. You can set the sensitivity, and Machine pretty much goes through the sample and detects where all the transients are and sets a marker at that position. And then by applying that grid, each transient gets sent to a note in the keyboard roll. So yeah, I like to do that quite a lot. This was a QZB break. I highly recommend their Forge sample pack series. Some amazing sounds in there. And during the time that I was making this tune, I'd recently got my hands on one of the packs, and yeah, it really shows in this tune. Yeah, this is what this break sounds like, or what I've done with it. yeah, kind of just chopping up the original break and then rearranging it in the MIDI keyboard. Again, not too much processing here, just kind of taking out the mids and taking out some resonant frequencies. Yeah. Same thing with this break. With the kick and the snare, sounds like this. And the other break. So yeah, at this stage, there's not really too much concern about the mix and how the elements sound. It's more of just creative process, writing, getting some ideas down, getting some grooves down. The only other two layers I made in Machine were this kind of splashy hat and this closed hat loop. Only interesting thing here is the velocity is kind of up and down for different notes to give it a little bit more of a human feel. All together. With drums, I do like to kind of beef them up as much as possible before exporting them for arrangements and mix down. And I try to do that here using some parallel processing. You can see Machine is a little bit limited. From what I understand, you can only create 2 sends per sound or per group. So I've got my drum group over here, and down here I've sent the drum bus to 2 separate tracks in group F. On group F, these are the 2 tracks, and on track 1 there's just some EQing, mainly bringing out the high end by a couple dB, and some parallel compression. Both these Native Instruments plugins, really nice. I've got the dry knob on this compressor set up all the way, and yeah, so it's like parallel compression. I don't know if that's the correct term, but that's what it seems like to me. On the second track of the send, we have an instance of FabFilter Saturn, just adding some clean tube saturation and boosting the mids, and an instance of FabFilter Pro Q2, boosting the mids and the upper mids as well. So yeah, that kind of ends it for the drums altogether. Cool. Then over to the kind of bass group. Started out with something like this, just a massive preset that I found. Most of my bass design will stem from presets, user presets that I've downloaded. Just flick through them, find something that I like, and I think one of the first instances of this massive preset was this. Not really too much going on there, just like the percussive sort of attack on the sub bass sound. And then we copy that over. Tweaked the massive preset a little bit, added some chorus, maybe a little bit more drive to bring out the high end and widen it up a little bit, and then some EQing. If I'm not mistaken, I think this EQ is to make a little bit of room for where the snare is sitting, and then bringing out some of the air of the bass. Yeah. Next layer is going to be the main sort of sub layer of the bass sound. So yeah, all that's really happening here is the high end being cut out with a little bit of a notch around the low mids, and then I've compressed the sub bass and mixed the dry signal back in. My idea here is to try and bring out the uh, softer harmonics in the bass. Yeah, that's the idea. Altogether, it sounds like this. So yeah, I really like the kind of movement in the bass. And we've got this layer over here as well. If I'm not mistaken, okay, no, I think it is a different massive preset, yeah. But again, super simple, just for some EQing and a bunch of saturation and some more EQing after that. A little bit of reverb to kind of put it in a space and give it some width. Another kind of key sound of the tune is this bass patch here. Then onto some of more of like the mid bass hits. All of these sounds, well, nearly all of them are sounds taken from QZB sample packs, kind of just sitting and going through the long loops that they have and picking out nice sounds. Yeah, they sound like this. So yeah, these are more, maybe not mid bass, but more kind of like higher mids, some flavor here and there to throw in between the drums. Not really a lot of processing on any of these tunes. Maybe a little bit of EQing and filtering of the low end. And yeah, this pattern is maybe more of the mid bass sounds with the drums. So yeah, same thing here. Not really a lot of processing, just some EQing. Yeah, same EQ. That kind of sums it up for the bass and the drums section, or where the bass and the drums came from. But let's head through to FL Studio. What up, and welcome to my FL Studio project. Probably the first thing you'll notice is it's super colorful. I like to keep everything kind of color coded. Usually start out with the drums at the top, then bass is next, and then kind of just in order of importance or in order of what I added everything in. So there's kind of mid-range synth stuff over here, vocal elements, and then just pads and FX right at the bottom. So my mixer rack kind of matches. Everything is in groups or bust already. Work off a custom template. All the drums are in this section. All the basses are in this section. Atmospheres over here. And then mid-range synths and stuff in this bus. And I added a separate bus for the vocals. Yeah, and then I've got a couple reverb sends right at the end, and couple of FX sends that I ended up using on some bass sounds just to give them a bit more beef and a bit more width. Which of these are actually in use is okay. Yeah, cool. So I guess we'll get into those buses when we look at the bass. Let's start out with the drums though, picking up where we left off in Machine. So as you can see, kind of cut up the kick and the snare. I think what often happens due to the processing and stuff in Machine, some of the snare hits will be a bit louder, or some of the kick hits will be a bit softer. So I try and grab the loudest bits of each, and only did some minor cutting up and rearranging of one of the drum breaks. I think I remember something wasn't really working too well with the groove, so had to rearrange that. But processing on the individual channels, the kick, the snare, and the different loops, isn't really too extensive. Maybe some EQing and a little bit of saturation. What I do like to do is group my hats together into a kind of hat bus before they get sent to the drum bus. I find it nice to process the whole hat group in one way by adding like a little bit of wave shaping or saturation. And this also allows me to sidechain all the hats to the kick and the snare if need be. So yeah, I think most of the processing is actually happening in these parallels. So yeah, this is kind of how all of my groups are set up. All of the tracks will be routed into one bus, in this case the drum bus, and then I will route this drum bus to 3 separate parallels. This is a little bit different from how I set things up now, but for all intents and purposes, it's what I still do. And I find it gives you, each parallel kind of gives me a little extra layer of control over the drums or the basses. But on the main drum bus, just got a little bit of EQing, bringing out the high mids, some more EQing, bringing out the highs, and a little bit of the lower mids, adding some transient shaping, and soft clipping. I think my idea for that was to get the drums a bit louder without actually redlining on the mixer. And the first parallel is some very heavy sidechain, well, not sidechain compression, just regular compression. This is a super nifty plugin by Native Instruments. The way I understand this release and attack controls is kind of, if you want the sound to have more attack, you just kind of dial it up. And yeah, this release setting is quite high, so giving the drums a little bit more tail, I guess, and simultaneously kind of compressing the attack really, really hard. The next parallel channel is more for the transients. Got some Fab Filter Satin, saturation, kind of just boosted the EQ band all around. Orbit, this is a transient master, transient designer, and then another soft clipper just to stop redlining on the mixer from this transient shaper, which is really, really boosting the attack a lot. And this is the only one of the parallels of the drum bus that is actually being sent to a reverb. Convolution reverb by Mulder. I find it really, really useful for getting sounds to sound like they're coming from a certain space, like whether it's a room or a hall. I really like this reverb. There's some settings with super, super short decay times, which I find work really nicely on drums for a kind of slap effect. And then the last bus is a little bit of stereo width to the drums. Yeah, all together they sound like this. Especially with these drum parallels, I try and be really, really careful with adding filters and stuff like that. And adding certain plugins will introduce some weird phasing with all of these channels running in parallel. So whenever I do filter on a bus, I make sure that I'm kind of changing the sonic quality of the sound enough so that phasing isn't too noticeable or doesn't happen at all. But yeah, just something to look out for. That kind of sums it up for the drums. There's not really too many hi-hats going on. Most of the hi-hats are coming from these jungle loops. So that worked out quite nicely. Only other thing that's going on with the drums is a little bit of a filter. And in the intro, what's quite nice is that the drums are being sent to the reverb before they're being filtered. So there's this cool kind of effect where the wet and the dry signal are mixing in the intro. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up for the drums. Onto the basses. Cool. There's not really too much going on with the bass sounds as they are. There's only really three or four bass sounds throughout the entire tune or in this bass bus group. But individually, they don't really have too much processing. Most of the work is happening on the bass bus and on the subsequent parallel channels. And also these three bass sends. So yeah, there's a lot of sends, and I find that gives me a lot of control in determining how the sound sounds. On the bass bus, we've got TP bass lane just to keep everything kind of mono. Max bass, which is a waves plugin, it adds harmonics to the lower frequency of the sound. You can kind of dial it in. I find it super useful for getting my basses to be a bit more audible on phone speakers and Bluetooth speakers and that sort of thing. Kind of just takes the original sound and then adds harmonics in series, and you can kind of adjust that level of the harmonics. A little bit of EQing, Fab Filter Pro and B for some side chaining for the kick, and then Fruity Limiter for some side chaining to the snare. So all the bass sounds are being side chained to the kick and the snare. The first parallel channel is only for sub bass. I find it nice to kind of route everything into these parallels so that all of the sounds are kind of getting the same treatment and they kind of blend together a little bit more. Not really too much going on here besides some filtering and some more max bass to keep everything in mono. The second parallel channel is just a chain of saturation, EQing, etc. Kind of saturating the sound to add harmonics and to make the sound warmer, and then EQing out the kind of unwanted frequencies, taking out frequencies to kind of make other frequencies seem more prominent without having to boost them as much, and kind of making room for the drums. I'm guessing here, kind of like the resonant frequency of the drum and the snappiness of the drums. And then, yeah, kind of just repeating that exact same process. You'll notice this EQ looks pretty similar to the first one. It's just the process of slowly adding saturation and then EQing the unwanted frequencies out. This bus sounds like this. And then last but not least, this is just a kind of mid-range layer. I felt the bass in general was lacking some mid-range punch, so there's just some saturation and some kind of surgical EQing to take out all the low end and all the high end, and then a little bit of stereo width to the sound. Now for these kind of bass sends. So as well as being sent to the main bass bus, this bass sound is also being sent to 2 parallel channels. And in this first bass send one, there's quite a lot of processing going on, but it's not really anything different to the previous sort of approach of just adding saturation and EQing out unwanted elements. Just added a little bit of a gate at the end to cut the sound out. This bass send is also being sent to a bass reverb, kind of a roundabout way, but I like the way the reverb sounded coming from this send as opposed to just the mid bass track. And then this layer, this kind of little squelch, is also being sent to the same bass send, just for some more crunch and some more weight to the sound. That kind of sums it up for the bass bus. Yeah. All right then, let's move on to some of the kind of synths and mid-bass sounds. There's only 2 of them, and they sound like this. Not really too much processing going on with these sounds besides some saturation and some EQing. I felt the sounds already had most of their kind of stereo characteristics, and yeah, they sounded all right being bounced straight out of machine. The same kind of setup here with this mids bus, some parallel processing. This first parallel is going to be kind of for the lower range, adding quite a bit of saturation there. And then the second parallel is adding some width to the sounds, and yeah, just cutting out the low end. Not really much to be said here, but they do add a lot of flavor to the tune. Cool. I think the next thing we can look at would be the atmospheric elements. I feel like they breathe a lot of the life into the tune and give the tune its vibe. First element we're kind of introduced to in the tune is this pad, and this was made in Native Instruments Contour. Sounds like this. So processing on this sound, there's a bit of saturation, some EQing, some more saturation, and some multiband compression. The idea here was to kind of let some space for the other vocal sample to breathe in the tune. Kind of just wanted this to be a low range, sort of beefy sound in the intro of the tune, and there is some filtering as well. The next atmospheric element would be this vocal sample. This is just a cut of the original vocal. I think I found it on Splice. And yeah, not really too much going on. Just kind of changing the shape of this waveform using FL Studio's sampler. So it originally sounded like this. And this just kind of builds it in a little bit more. Yeah, all of these atmospheres are being sent to this convolution reverb, plate reverb. It gives it quite a nice sound, makes it sort of fit in a space. And yeah, there's a few other sort of glitchy impacts and rises in this bus as well. Some impacts. Yeah, not really too much to be said about these sounds. I think they just came about in some sound design sessions, messing around in Machine, and they all kind of work together and fit nicely in the tune, luckily. There's this little vocal riser over here. So this is just pretty much this vocal sample that's been reversed, and put an LFO on that, give it a cool effect. That pretty much sums it up for the atmospheres and kind of the rises. And I think the last thing we could look at would be the vocals. Vocals are super, super simple. A couple of just found maybe one or two phrases in these vocal samples and kind of cut them up, and they fit nicely with the tune. Reversed them as well, so they kind of flow into each other. And yeah, this vocal bus is side chained to the snare, just to make sure that the snare is cutting through everything in the mix. And on the individual vocals cuts, there's not really too much processing going on, maybe a little bit of stereo imaging. And on the bus, again, only a little bit of saturation, some EQing, and this vocal doubler to give some kind of chorusy sound. That's the way I kind of interpret this plugin. And yeah, most of the effects and stuff were dialed in Machine, with some big reverb and yeah, maybe a few other effects. And this vocal bus is being sent to its own reverb. And yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate the opportunity. And big ups to Calibrate Records. Peace, guys.